Hello, welcome to the podcast. I haven't had to use this platform for a while. I haven't even had to really use this title screen for a long time, but I've managed to repurpose it for my own purposes. As always, my name is Poptart. Welcome to the podcast. Haven't had to touch it in a while because of depression and just friends just disconnecting and falling out. But it is what it is. Anyway. Welcome to the podcast. It's just a special thing that I put together because I need to check to see if my mic is still working. Because this one, it's fine. This is just something that I put together because I have seen a lot of people say a lot of things about Baldur's Gate and misinterpreting a report made by IGN, which I did myself. But fortunately, there is a video game journalist place called The Escapist, which it's actually based in Australia, right next to me, so that's cool. I learnt about them through Yahtzee Crosshall, who does these very quick rants about video games. If you haven't seen Zero Punctuation, it's pretty much excuse me, I need to drink something real quick. I tell you, passion fruit soda, best flavour out there. It just can't be beat. I'm sorry. It is just the best. Mountain Dew finally did a flavour that I like. Anyway, so I was reading an article by them, and that actually did help me course correct this, because it was originally going to take a very different direction than what it was going to take today. You'll probably see that there's some Zelda. If you are watching this, you'll probably see that there is some Legend of Zelda stuff playing in the background. That's simply because I don't have a presentation set up for this. Like I said, I've been battling with depression at the moment, and I've only just been able to focus enough to put a very loose script together, which I think is amazing, and it's good enough for now. Next week when I redo this, I will put a proper thing together, but for now we'll just deal with this. So getting back to it, they had their viewpoint on it, and that allowed me to complete this in a way that I believe to be interesting. But before we get into it, I do have to give a quick disclaimer, just because I know people will be poking holes in this, and if you would like to do so, you're more than welcome enough. But just so I can cover my own ass, I am not a historian. While every attempt has been made to keep the facts as accurate as possible, I am one person, and I can only guarantee that I will try to be on point in this regard. And the reason I say that is because the history of video gaming is massive. Originally, this video was slated to be a multi-part series where I would go through the history of arcades, consoles, and then computers. But when I was about partway through the history of arcades and what that meant to gaming, the sheer mountain of information that I had to go through was huge. And that, I had to keep in mind, the mountain of information that I had to sift through, that was me just doing highlights. Like, I could, do I still have it? I think I do. I'll just pause this and see if I can bring it up. Yeah, so I'll just bring it up because I think it's a neat visual just to see how complicated the history of video gaming as a thing has gotten. Load storyline. Yeah. So you'll probably see it on... Yeah, there it is. So this is basic history of, like, video gaming, where it started. This was originally... this is where it started. It started, like, at a university where where the first video game was effectively made on an oscilloscope. And when Computer Space came out, which was a very crude attempt at a video game. It had been done before at this point, but this is the first one that really sort of branched into SNK, Sega, Atari, Taito, Konami, Capcom, and Namco doing their own shit, and then that branched off into several more shit, and like it just became Spaghetti Junction. So while I would have liked to have completed that, I feel given the scope of the video and what I was actually trying to do, with what Baldur's Gate has been misinterpreted as, I felt it more appropriate to rescope and refocus on what that meant to gaming, and that then allowed me to capitalize on the research that I had done into that point. But again, there is a lot to go over. I'm only one person, so I can only guarantee that I will be as accurate as I can. And there is a lot to go over, so there's probably going to be insert niche video game thing here that I've missed, and it's not that I'm trying to be a dick, it's just, like, to do it to that level of completeness takes literal decades of researching, cross-referencing, comparing notes with people who probably have done this before, getting access to records that you're not really supposed to have access to, or just generally aren't available, and on and on and on and on and on. So, at best, I can only cover the base accuracy of what you could get out of surface information and try to contextualize that and what Baldur's Gate actually is. In terms of is it a new standard or not. Any mention of any persons, groups, companies, locations, or intellectual property is done under fair use and released poorly, as mentioned. The following documentary or podcast, if you're listening to this and I've finished and put it on Spotify, contains coarse language and should not be viewed by anyone for any reason, or listened to by anyone for any reason. And my lunch just arrived. Hold up. One of the few things I'll actually break for lunch. Okay, cool. Lunch is important, people. Okay, so getting back to it. So, just a little bit about me. My name is Poptart. I'm a part-time streamer, full-time useless twat, according to that one guy who I work with at work. And full disclosure, because we are going to be talking about D&D, and people are going to probably quote that I've played in D&D in the past and stuff like that. Yes, I am in fact a fan of D&D. I make no bones about it. I don't attempt to hide it. So I will try to be as unbiased as I can. But I make no promises. Although if you want like a metric of my level of bias or potential bias, like I have a dice collection at home. I still have all of my original 5e books. It's great. I love it. And the reason I bring that up is Baldur's Gate. It's created a lot of discussion or on the industry as a whole and what they really haven't been doing properly for a long, long time. And IGN, because they are who they are, they've not lied in their documentary or their release on Baldur's Gate 3, but they haven't exactly been they're very carefully crafted a video designed to create what I feel is, oh, thank you for the follow. They're very carefully created what I feel to be a very tilted narrative designed to incite and create unrest in such a way where they feel as though Baldur's Gate is the new standard. It is how things should be done, could be done, and if you don't do it, you're useless. That is not correct, but before we talk about why that's not correct, we need to contextualize gaming from a historical standpoint so we can understand just exactly why it's taken so long to reach a point where this is even a thing, and what is like gaming as a entity. Like if you were to create its own biometer, how would you tell if a game is or isn't accurate or not, or well, made well in another sense? To that end, in very generalized term, because you have to understand creating games or the gaming community is a very complex beast, so it's kind of hard to file it down into simple terms and look at it from a distance. So based on the research that I've done, based on my understanding of gaming, which goes from where I am now to gaming on a Windows 3.5 computer that was left out in the rain, and I just played Lemmings on it for nothing other than shits and giggles, I believe gaming to be divided into three distinct parts. The players, who are people who play the game, the developers, who are people who make the game, and then the infrastructure that everyone both plays and develops on. Funny that I'm playing Zelda at the moment, because you could quite easily call this the quote-unquote Triforce of gaming. And the reason I call it a Triforce of gaming is because no one part can wholly or partly survive unless the other properly supports it. So if you have a developer who can't make games, that means there's nothing for the infrastructure to run, there's nothing for the players to enjoy. If the players aren't there, then there's nothing for the player. Then there's a game that a player can't play, and then a game for the infrastructure to not use, and then so on into infinite combinations that pretty much serve as an example of a game. Like, very loosely, you could apply this to any game and go and get a general feel for how well that game is made based on how well it balances these 3 points. And the first example I can think of, which is actually the first video game ever made where this was appropriately balanced at all and set the inspiration for video games as a culture going forward, was a very, very old game called Tennis for Two. Now, that game populated. That game you may not have heard of, but it is, by all accounts, the first video game that was ever made, ever, for any reason. It was developed, I'll just bring up my notes. Let's see, just scrolling back through here. Yeah. So, Tennis for Two. The concept of a video game really hasn't sorry, I got something stuck in my throat. The concept of a video game really wasn't thought about at the time, but it was developed by a man by William and built by a man by Robert, and it was effectively developed on a analog computer, which is a very, very simple computer designed to basically add and subtract numbers, and as a very simplified example of what it does. And it was designed for Brookhaven National Laboratories annual public exhibition, which is where the people would come in, they'd see what they were up to, and he thought it would be neat if he created a game based on hardware that was designed to track missile trajectories. And it was basically Tennis for Two, was you pass a virtual tennis ball from one side of the court to the other, and then someone would try to pass it back, and it was a very simple game, especially by today's standards, but when he launched it, it was immediately adopted by everyone, and of course high school students jumped on it, and they were like, holy crap, this is amazing. It only ran for 2 years in 1958 exhibition and then the 1959 exhibition. Unfortunately, when the actual setup, because you have to keep in mind it was run off an analog computer, which was run into an oscilloscope, which had custom controllers wired into it, and it was on very, very old hardware that was prone to failure. And it did. They put it into storage, and I believe at one point they did go back to it to see if it still powered on, to see if it worked. Unfortunately, due to old age and whatever condition it was in, because there's not a lot of history available about exactly what condition it was in. Believe me, I looked, and this is so damn old that any records that exist at the time only vaguely reference later Donner analog computers and the specific models that it was recreated on, but unfortunately it didn't work, so both William and Robert remade it on a Donner Model 3400, which is a later version of exactly the same machine, and then I believe a fan who was looking into it recreated it himself for shits and giggles on a Model 3500. And the game pretty much served as inspiration for every piece of gaming history going forward for the next several decades. But it is quite sad that what is to be considered the father of gaming, or mother of gaming, I suppose is more accurate term, it no longer exists. If it does exist, it exists only as bone and metal, which is not a very appropriate way to refer to it. But yeah, this going forward then led to Computer Space, which it's hard to describe what this game is, because even at the time, it was deemed a failure amongst other arcades at the time. It was, by all accounts, it was just you controlled a ship that shot down UFOs, but because the controls were exceedingly convoluted and made no sense to its target audience, it really didn't achieve any level of success, and it was eventually dropped. And we could go on and on and on and on, but this is a pretty good example of how how Tennis for Two was developed and built on hardware that worked and enjoyed by everyone who played it, and it's probably the first and only example I've come across that has received a 100% pass mark if you were to apply the Triforce of Gaming to it and see how well is this game balanced from both a development standpoint, a hardware standpoint, and the enjoyment of the players. Computer Space, however, is probably the first example the first well-documented example of how a developer created a game that worked, that was developed on hardware that caused the players to lose interest and is severely unbalanced from this perspective. And I could probably go on and on and on different examples, but these are just the early examples of how video games can, be developed and either received greatly or received poorly based on certain decisions by certain people. And you need to understand these are not unique examples, and you sort of have a hit and miss throughout the history of gaming. But it did. But this alone started, arcades as a concept, as a culture, as a meeting ground, as whatever it means to you. It matters. Believe me, it does. But I emphasize arcades for two reasons. First, generally speaking, generally speaking, and with very few exemptions, arcades are the only example in gaming that I can think of where a developer created a game from a code perspective, that is like what the game is made of, that ran successfully on launch and had little, if not no, bugs from factory. And also, unless you were unskilled, or even if you were unskilled, gamers, enjoyed these experiences. They enjoyed playing on arcades pretty much across the board, and pretty much set the benchmark yet again for what it meant to develop and release a game that players enjoyed and sold well. Classic examples that I can think of that have done well historically and even to this day are games like Street Fighter, Metal Slug, and Space Invaders as well. And I think Space Invaders is like another example that I've come across where a developer has actually failed on the infrastructure side of gaming, but he failed successfully. Let's take a closer look at that. So, released in 1978 from developer Taito, Space Invaders was a relatively simple game. It was pretty much you controlled a tank, I believe is what they refer to it at the time, which traversed from side to side, and you shot down like invading aliens, and people loved it. It was great. It was awesome. Problem is, not a problem as such, but what it's mostly known for is the game progressively got faster and faster and faster the more aliens you shot down, and this actually wasn't intentional from the developer. See, the way the game is coded, it was meant to be fast from start to finish. It was never meant to progressively get faster and faster and faster. It was just meant to be like, pretty much a precursor to bullet hell games. And the reason it was released in that state is because the developer, let's see if I can find his name. I'm going to butcher this name, and I apologize. Nishikaido was one of those developers who wanted to both make this game but release it on his own hardware. He didn't want to use something, a cabinet that was pre-built. He wanted to grab components from industry and put them together into something that he thought was the correct way to do things. So he got his hardware that he thought would work. He created the code, which actually worked, and the problem came when, not the problem, but the issue in the code that he noticed came to when he went to do a live test. See, he was intending for the game to run as I just described, but what was holding the game back was the microprocessor he used, which is a Intel Model 8080. It wasn't exceptionally powerful. It was all of 2.5 megahertz to 3.125 megahertz on a good day, and it simply wasn't capable of displaying and moving sprites, as many sprites as there were on the screen at any given time. So when he ran it to completion. He defeated all of the aliens, because, he's a developer, why wouldn't he? Did some more testing, and, again, he was a bit concerned that the game wasn't running as intended, but when he finished his testing, he decided that although the hardware wasn't capable of running the game as he intended, because of the novelty of the game getting faster and faster and faster without him having to really do anything. He decided that it was in the player's best interest to have this experience because it provided a unique challenge that he really hadn't seen before, that he really, really enjoyed. And to this day, people who played the game have fond memories of it because of what is technically an infrastructure fault that was left in place by the developers to support the players. So, although it technically failed on that front, overall it was a success and it sold quite well and is remembered fondly by anyone who's played it for any length of time. And it's not the first time in gaming history that a developer has failed from an infrastructure perspective, but overall has succeeded because of it. One title that comes to mind is Grand Theft Auto. Not like Grand Theft Auto that was released by Rockstar. It was the original Grand Theft Auto, the one that was developed for Microsoft DOS, if you can believe it. No, I'm a huge fan of the Grand Theft Auto series, and I love it. Not necessarily because of the cops chasing after you. That's a little bit annoying, but I remember when I had a PlayStation 2 and I had Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, I just spend, when I just had no real interest in playing the actual game, I just spend hours roaming through the countryside and creating a road train of tractors that I just found and stole because I could. Don't steal in real life, though. Okay, so the original game was developed by, DMA Designed, not as as Grand Theft Auto as we know it today, but it was developed as a completely separate game called Race and Chase. They were slating to release it on the PlayStation, DOS, Windows 95, Sega Saturn, and I believe the Nintendo 64. So, for the time, it had quite a wide range of platforms it was planning to release on. And the concept was pretty simple. It was, you do the crime, you get chased by cops, and then the objective is to really escape. Now, what the game was supposed to do is when you were driving your car and trying to get away, the cops wouldn't actually reach you. The code was set up so that the barrier that they were supposed to be chasing after, or where they were supposed to be navigating to, was a radius around the car itself, and it was backed off by, I think, half a car length, I believe, was where they were supposed to stay away from. The problem is, the pathfinding in the game itself thought that where they were supposed to navigate to wasn't actually half a car length away from the car, it was inside the car. So what playtesters noticed is when they actually got the cops on them, the cops would constantly try to crash into them and run them off the road. And this wasn't intentional, and developers were quite confused, which is, obviously when they did their research, looked at the code, and figured out exactly what the hell was going on. Now, at that point, they could have, tweaked the code. They could have gotten rid of it somehow, maybe increased the boundary that they were supposed to stay away from by however many in-game measurements they were supposed to keep the code running as they intended. But again, the infrastructure failure that the developers refused to fix was not fixed because the players enjoyed it. And because they enjoyed it, they rebranded Cops and Race and Chase as Grand Theft Auto, developed it, added some things in, and we had Grand Theft Auto London, which then led to every other Grand Theft Auto since. And every single game you've enjoyed exists purely because a bug that was never supposed to be there that players enjoyed exists purely as some sort of fluke that now was the staple for everything going forward. And I think it's just neat to see shit like that happen in industry, because it's like how cool is that your accident becomes your success? That's just cool. I love seeing that shit, and they've made a shitload of money from that ever since. And there are also times when the developers of the infrastructure don't exactly support the players, or the developers even. An infamous example is Crash Bandicoot series. Now, Crash Bandicoot is a 3D platformer developed by Naughty Dog. And it's one of those examples where they had some... Well, it's not one of those examples. It's just a game that they were trying to develop, and they had a dev kit that was thousands of times more capable than the final release, and they knew that. And the problem was, when they did their research on it at Naughty Dog, as co-director Andy Gavin goes on to say on a interview with Ars Technica, which I encourage you to watch if you're at all curious about the specifics. The problem was the hardware was a lot more capable than Sony was allowing it to be, because when a developer develops video games for a console, they develop around certain libraries that tell code how to interact with the hardware, and the libraries that they had only allowed to use like a very small percentage of what the PlayStation 1 was capable of at the time. So through a series of backdoor conversations with people that he knew at Sony, Andy Gavin eventually got some background information and access to certain parts of how the actual PlayStation 1 worked, that he's since been sworn to secrecy about who and how he got it from. And that then made him realize that the game, while it could run on the dev kit, needed to be severely cut down and redeveloped so that it could run as smooth as it did. Some things that he had to do, him and his team, let's be fair, he's not the only one developing it, is he had to do things like he had to cut out certain dimensions. So there are times in the game where it will have a boulder chasing you, and that's to save on certain parts of the level just being taken away for reasons of both enjoying the game but allowing the game to run at all. And speaking of allowing the game to run at all, he also figured out that if he loaded game assets into 65k files, or 64k files, I should say, and positions them in the game in such a way where it would only load what the game needed based on where you were on the map, it allowed the game to run a lot more smoothly and efficiently, which is why you never really see a lag spike in the game, like, at all. Like, it just doesn't happen. And yeah, it also allows you to run the game how the game was originally intended from like a 3D perspective, but to, again, save on not loading what it didn't need. It also switched from this is now a 3D platform to this is now a 2D platform, while also keeping some 3D assets as well. And then he also put time limits on the game as well, so it wasn't running unnecessarily long, which again allowed the game to run smoother, because that's another dimension that he's eliminating. And it pretty much like ticked all the boxes. It may not have been perfect on all three fronts, but it's a very good example of how a developer, through actual effort, can overcome the limitations of the platform that they're releasing on to allow their game to be enjoyed by their players with very little to no restriction at all. But of all the stories of the era that I've heard of this specific snapshot in time, the one I love the most actually doesn't come from a developer, it comes from Intel, and it's not specifically a dev program issue, it's not a player program, it's sort of kind of an infrastructure thing that I just wanted to bring up because I thought it was quite funny. And yeah, it goes like this. So the original Doom, the one that was released on floppy disks, it was very, very popular at the time, and people, when they were playing it, and also figured out a couple of things. First, there's a multiplayer aspect to it that allowed you to play with people on your network, which is cool. they also figured out that there's no copyright protection on these floppy disks. So, what people at Intel did is they figured out how to share files and also play games with each other at the exact same time. So you had hundreds of people playing hundreds of instances of this game and sharing hundreds of copies of this installation of Doom. And what ended up happening is that combination of network traffic and people just doing what they're not supposed to be doing ended up in Intel figuring out that their users are breaking their networks, and they, to this day, as far as I'm aware, they have banned the original Doom on all Intel property, and it seems silly to think that it would still be banned, but I'm fairly sure they still have that ban in effect purely to prevent the network from crashing, which I don't see why it would crash now, but no, it's possible. It could probably happen. But all of these examples that I've mentioned are examples where gaming as a whole has been unbalanced, but not in a way where either the developers or the players or even the infrastructure really suffered too much. The issue I've seen with gaming, the reason I'm making this video, is because there have been examples, especially in recent history, where one or more points have been pushed so severely out of balance that it's caused a massive, and I mean massive, uproar in the community. And there are no end of examples at all. There are no, I could probably throw a stick into gaming culture and find insert company here who did act Y, who pissed off everyone all at once. But the most accurately documented one that I could find that I personally experienced was Mass Effect Andromeda. Now, we all know Mass Effect Andromeda. We all know Mass Effect. For those who don't know, it's a game developed it's a series developed by BioWare. And it was originally developed on the Unreal 3 engine, which, even to this, well, not specifically Unreal 3, but the Unreal engine was originally developed to play Unreal Tournament, but the engine itself got so popular that they just decided to release it as its own product, and a lot of games use the Unreal engine or a variant of it. Excuse me, I had a burpee. Now, the problem with Mass Effect is up until this point, BioWare had successfully created not one, not two, but 3 best-selling titles using the Unreal engine. The early examples probably aren't the best, but, they did a lot with what they had. It was great. And the problem came when they partnered with EA. Now, EA, at the time Mass Effect Andromeda was being developed, was around 2014, where EA was making a massive push for everyone to use the Frostbite engine. Now, for those who don't know what an engine is, it is, in modern gaming, it is everything that a game is effectively built around. The models, what happens in the game, what doesn't happen in the game, everything is contained within the engine. And the problem with the Frostbite engine is it did a lot of things, and it did them really well, but it wasn't as flexible or able in the same way that the Unreal engine was, and this led to a lot of people at BioWare being upset, which then led to key developers who were responsible for making the game what it was, just leave BioWare and never come back. This caused delays, this caused people to be severely overworked, and this is why there are a lot of, bugs and errors, I should say, in the code. And originally they were actually planning to release Andromeda on the Unreal Engine. That's what they were wanting to do. But, again, that it was massively out of their hands and they couldn't do it, so they had to redevelop the whole game on, the Frostbite engine, which, while it did function, it had a lot of errors when it came to gameplay. It didn't really run all that great. and unfortunately, a lot of people ended up having a very sour experience, especially on launch. Like, I'm fairly certain they had to release some patches for it as well, but yeah, it was pretty much chaos in that game from day one. And this is after several $1 million of investment into a title that really shouldn't have had this many bugs. Also, another problem that led to this is that they had a lot of talent leaving from a lot of locations across the world. I believe it was BioWare Montreal that was the head for the development on Mass Effect Andromeda, and they were struggling because of this. So, because of this, the game was a junky, barely pile functioning of code that barely functioned, that should have had a lot more content. There was actually, when I did some research on the game, there was actually plans to release DLC for the game, but because of how the game tanked, they cancelled DLC. They didn't really develop the game too much more, and in spite of all they were trying to do, in spite of everything, the developers leaving, them dropping pre-generated worlds for pre-made worlds, in spite of all of that, the game actually made a profit, which I'm honestly surprised about, because they murdered this game. Like, if you've ever seen memes about, the janky animation from Andromeda and stuff like that, in spite of all of that, and probably the bugs in the code that you haven't experienced and I have, it is a wonder that the game sold, as well as it did. And I'm almost fairly certain that's mainly down to nostalgia of Mass Effect 1 through 3, rather than how well Andromeda was built at all, because it was not built well. How even Mass Effect 3, like the last game in the series, which had fans, fucking at the gates because of how the game ended, had a lot better reception than this ever did. And I think that's a shame, because, like I said, I played through the game a couple of times, and there's just so much potential for them to have done better, and they just didn't, and I think that's a shame. But, yeah. And it's not like they didn't really have EA didn't have the money or the funding or the background to work with. Like, they had a well-established title, they had developers out the wazoo, and they could have done better if they just let BioWare do the voodoo that they do, but because they were trying to make profit on the Frostbite engine, they almost killed a very beloved title, and I think this is not okay. Like, and as someone who works with their hands, who works with craftsmen, who has worked with developers before, when a developer comes to you and he says, this is the way things are, this is why we need to do things, if we don't do it, it will fail, and then it fails, and the reason it fails is because of corporate greed, it does get me very, very upset that happens, because it's not like they weren't warned, it's just they didn't care because of profit, and the developer's quality of work suffered as a result thereof. And unfortunately, this isn't the only example of this happening. Like, it has happened multiple times throughout gaming history, and it's probably going to continue to happen, but before we start bashing big-name developers, before we start getting upset at everyone who releases a janky bunch of code, you need to realize that up until this point, where we've gone relative success to objective fucking failure, you need to realize that back in the day, games were really, really simple. You effectively had a line of code that it was reading, that the game was supposed to read from, and then maybe some basic libraries that it was, referencing to outside of the game itself. And because of that, the game didn't really have a lot of meat to it. It was really simple, it was very basic, and there was little, if not no, chance for failure. The problem with gaming as it exists now is that it's got severely complex with tools required to be learnt by pretty much everyone in levels of complexity that, you or I probably would never be able to do. And while I'm not saying we cut them endless amounts of slack, I would never say cut them endless amounts of slack. If you are a developer for a game and you're developing on an engine, you should probably know how it works. What I am saying is, with games as complex as they are, I think we should at least try to understand that it's not as simple as it was. And I think we should just be a little bit more understanding when a game releases buggy on launch, because it's kind of hard with how complicated games are to achieve that level of success. In fact, it really doesn't happen. Most games that release now have one form of bug in them or another, which is what leads me on to the meat and potatoes of this podcast, which is Baldur's Gate 3. Now, Baldur's Gate 3, let me just be clear on this. The reason people are having a bit of controversy around it is because people seem to think, based on a video that IGN released, that it is the new standard. It is how things are supposed to be done. It is everything that games are required to be going forward because of this, because of what it's achieved. But what you need to understand is Larian Studios, which is the people who have developed this game, they had a lot of things going for them that most game companies just don't have now. Like, you just don't see these examples in the industry anymore. First of all, they had a long development cycle, like a long development cycle. Like, the game just released this month, and they just released August of 2023, for those who are watching this in the future. But it started its development way back in 2017, and this gave them a shitload of time to write and test code, to develop a rich storyline, to do things such as tying in music and voice actors, and slate it for release in this month of this year. And because of that, they received a very rare score from Metacritic, which is a site which aggregates scores given by reviewers, and gives it an overall rating of 96 out of 100, which, to my knowledge, doesn't just happen. It's not something Metacritic is capable, or really does a lot. If at all they do it. And that's just because they had a lot of lead time to polish game code, voice line, voice actors, and release a product that, while it's not free of bugs, because I've had to release a patch recently to fix a few errors, the infrastructure it plays on is capable of playing that game that developed in the way that the developers intended, to a point, in a way that the game players enjoyed. So, at least from that perspective, it's very well developed and, very well balanced in that sense. Also, they have a team of about some 400 staff working on this game from several locations around the world. And these staff members have multiple years' experience developing several hit titles. So it's not like they don't have any experience, and they're working on a platform that they've developed in-house to create a game that just works. So I think, that's something you just don't see. Like, they don't have any outside influence. They don't have EA saying you have to use Frostbite to make this thing. No, they just worked on what they knew. They allowed themselves to perfect this craft over many, many years, and eventually led to releasing a game that, while not perfect, worked really, really well, because they knew the tools that they were working with. Second and third, and this is the final point I'll lead off of, is they had what led to this game selling and being as popular as it was they were working with a title that people knew, that people loved. They were working with D&D, and the reason it was so popular at the time is because you had a bunch of shows just popularizing it, such as Critical Role, Dungeons and Daddies, Adventure Zone, that people grew into and loved as podcasts, and that then popularized D&D, which then led to people refinding or getting referred to Baldur's Gate 3, which then allowed the game to do well even in the beta testing of the phase. Like, it got so... Like, there are people who have played it since it was in beta who then transferred their game save files to, like, the live version that we see now, and are continuing to play the game. In fact, I think in the week of release... I'll just see if I can find it. Like, just so I can give you a metric of how popular this game is. Whoops, nope, that's not good. I'll open up Steam, actually, because they released it on Steam, I believe. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah. So this is just what they've been tracking of how successful the game's going. Obviously, that's no surprise there. Let's see, where is it? Yeah, so this is how successful the game has been. Week 1, they played 10... They played over the 1,255 years worth of gameplay in the first week alone, just to give you a metric of how much people have enjoyed this one title. And that's just a testament to the success that Larian Studios has achieved, because they worked with what they knew. They developed a game that, while it may not have been perfect on launch, worked like relatively close to what they expected, and they developed a game for the players that they enjoyed, because they worked on a title that people knew and loved, and just, like, achieved dub after dub after dub after dub because of it. Also, Scratch is the best boy, and I wouldn't be surprised if that, like, he's been petted well over 750,000 times at this point. But although they have achieved this level of success, I just want to make one thing very clear. Not every developer has 400 staff in several locations around the world, probably more at this point. Not every staff has the ability to have a development cycle that long due to budget constraints, due to staff constraints, due to many other reasons that we're probably never going to be aware of. Not every other staff has the advantage to work on a title as well known as D&D, and because of that, it is impossible and unfair to say that Baldur's Gate is the new standard, because that implies that every other developer should, could, and is otherwise able to achieve that standard. A standard has to be realistic. It has to be something that people can achieve, and not everyone in industry can achieve this. It's just not going to happen. What I do believe, however, what I do think Baldur's Gate 3 has achieved for Larian Studios is that it's proven that developers can, not should, but can release a well-balanced game that people enjoy, that people want to play. And I hope that there is some developer out there, some indie studio, someone who is developing a code or a story or whatever that shows that if they work on their craft and polish it and get good at what they do and enjoy what they do and just connect with their audience and develop something that they know they will enjoy, it is possible not to achieve what they've done, but to achieve great success in what it is that they are trying to do. And I just hope that there is someone out there who hears this, who looks at what Baldur's Gate has done and receives some small shining light of hope. Anyway, as always, my name is Poptart. Welcome to my channel. If you want to keep up to date with what I'm doing, when I'm streaming, or who I'm streaming with, you can type in !links into the chat at any time. I'm active on Twitter, TikTok, Discord, YouTube, and right here at home on Twitch. And until I see you later on today, while I'll be streaming, funnily enough, more Baldur's Gate 3, goodbye for now, and I hope to see you there. And if I don't see you there, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.